No one heard Frank Lucas coming. There were no turf wars, no public executions, no headlines announcing his rise. Yet one day, Harlem simply belonged to him. In a world where power was usually taken through fear, Frank Lucas built something different. He did not rely on intimidation. He did not rule through violence. He ruled through structure, discipline, and silence. And for years, that made him untouchable. To understand how this was possible, you have to understand Harlem in the 1960s. The neighborhood was fractured. Gangs fought openly. The mafia controlled the drug trade through layers of middlemen. Police corruption was common, and violence was the language of power. Fear ruled the streets. Frank Lucas rejected that model entirely. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if you love true crime cases, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Frank Lucas, born in 1930 in rural North Carolina, Lucas grew up poor, observant, and cautious. He learned early that violence solved short-term problems but created long-term enemies. Survival required patience. Power requires understanding people. When Lucas arrived in Harlem, he did not rush into crime. He watched. He studied who held influence, how money moved, and why empires collapsed. He learned that most criminal organizations failed for the same reason. They relied on fear, which invited rebellion, informants, and attention. Lucas found a mentor in Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's most respected figure. Bumpy ruled without constant violence. He believed reputation, fairness, and consistency were stronger than brutality. Lucas absorbed these lessons quietly. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, Harlem expected chaos. Rival gangs prepared for war. The mafia anticipated reclaiming lost control. Police braced for bloodshed. Instead, Frank Lucas moved silently. He did not fight for territory. He did not threaten rivals. He focused on one thing: supply. At the time, the mafia controlled heroin distribution in New York by importing it through multiple intermediaries. Prices were inflated. Quality was inconsistent. Lucas saw inefficiency, and inefficiency meant vulnerability. He went directly to the source in Southeast Asia, cutting out the mafia entirely. This was not an act of aggression. It was an act of strategy. By controlling supply, Lucas controlled behavior. He introduced a product called Blue Magic, pure, consistent, and reliable. Dealers switched loyalties without being forced. Customers followed. Violence decreased because the system no longer depended on fear to function. Lucas enforced strict rules. No unnecessary violence. No public disputes. No attention. Anyone who broke the rules was removed quietly, not terrorized, not humiliated. The punishment was simple: exclusion from the system. Harlem began to change. Streets grew quieter. The chaos didn't disappear, it became managed. Fear no longer ruled the drug trade. Predictability did. Frank Lucas had begun building an empire without fear. And the most dangerous part was that almost no one noticed it happening. Frank Lucas understood something most criminals never did. Fear is unstable. It forces obedience, but it also breeds resentment, betrayal, and mistakes. Loyalty, on the other hand, creates order, and the order lasts longer. Lucas designed his organization to function without intimidation. There were no public beatings, no random violence, no chaos meant to send a message. Instead, there were rules, clear, consistent, and enforced without emotion. Every associate knew what was expected. Do your job, stay quiet, follow the system. Anyone who violated those rules wasn't threatened, they were removed. No access to product meant no money, and in Lucas's world, exclusion was more powerful than fear. He structured his operation like a business. Each person had a role and no one knew more than they needed to. Couriers moved shipments. Distributors handled sales. Money handlers tracked profits. No one had a full view of the system. This limited risk and discouraged betrayal. Because Lucas paid fairly and consistently, people stayed. There was no need to steal, no need to cheat. Stability bred loyalty. Associates didn't fear Lucas, they trusted him, and trust is far harder to break than fear. His product, Blue Magic, reinforced this loyalty. Its quality was consistent. Dealers didn't worry about bad batches. Customers returned. Profits were predictable. Lucas didn't demand allegiance. He earned it through reliability. The streets reflected this discipline. Violence declined not because people became peaceful, but because chaos disrupted business. Disputes were handled internally and quietly. Public attention was avoided at all costs. Law enforcement struggled to understand what they were seeing. Crime was still present, but the usual signs, turf wars, shootings, informants, were missing. Arrests did not disrupt supply. The system absorbed losses and continued functioning. Even the mafia felt the shift. Their power had relied on reputation and intimidation. Lucas had replaced that with efficiency. He didn't challenge them directly. He simply made their model obsolete. Harlem adjusted. Dealers followed rules. Streets became predictable. Fear no longer dictated behavior, access did. Lucas rarely needed to speak. The system enforced itself. People protected it because it protected them. By removing fear from his empire, Frank Lucas had done something unprecedented. He had created a criminal organization that functioned on trust, discipline, and predictability, qualities normally associated with legitimate institutions. And that made it more dangerous than anything built on violence. Once Frank Lucas had stabilized Harlem, expansion became inevitable. But growth, if handled recklessly, could destroy everything he had built. Most criminal empires collapsed when they expanded too fast, drawing attention, creating internal conflict, and multiplying mistakes. Lucas was determined not to repeat those failures. He expanded slowly and deliberately. Each new city followed the same blueprint that had worked in Harlem: direct supply, consistent product, clear rules, no unnecessary violence. The system came first, always. Philadelphia, New Jersey, and other East Coast markets absorbed Lucas's structure with little resistance. Dealers were not forced into submission. They were offered something better than fear: stability. Predictable profits replaced uncertainty. Discipline replaced chaos. Blue Magic became more than a product, it became a signal. Its presence meant the system was in place. Quality never changed. Supply never disappeared. Dealers trusted it and customers followed naturally. With expansion came risk. Every new associate increased the chance of error, arrest, or betrayal. Lucas responded by tightening compartmentalization. Drivers didn't know distributors. Distributors didn't know suppliers. Money handlers didn't know routes. No one had enough information to expose the entire operation. Fear was still absent. Instead of threats, Lucas relied on structure. People followed rules because breaking them meant exclusion. No access to the system meant no income. The consequences were economic, not violent. Law enforcement began to notice the pattern. Arrests failed to disrupt supply. Violence was unusually low for a major heroin operation. The streets were quiet, but the flow of drugs was steady and massive. Investigators searched for intimidation, for fear-based control, for violent leaders. They found none. The system did not match their expectations, and that confusion bought Lucas time. The mafia, long accustomed to ruling through intimidation, watched their influence shrink further. Lucas had not confronted them. He had simply replaced their outdated model with something more efficient. Expansion tested Lucas's philosophy. Could an empire without fear survive across multiple cities? Could discipline replace intimidation at scale? For a time, the answer was yes. The system held. Loyalty remained strong. Violence remained low. Profits soared. Lucas controlled supply, behavior, and order across entire regions. without needing to scare anyone into obedience. But growth carries its own danger. The more successful the system became, the harder it was to hide. The larger it grew, the more eyes began to notice. Federal authorities were no longer chasing dealers. They were studying networks. And slowly, quietly, the pressure began to build. By the mid-1970s, federal authorities realized they were not dealing with a typical criminal operation. There were no open turf wars, no public executions, no visible leaders ruling through intimidation. Yet heroin continued to flow through Harlem and beyond with remarkable consistency. Investigators began shifting tactics. Instead of chasing violence, they studied patterns. Shipments arrived on schedule. Quality never fluctuated. Arrests failed to disrupt distribution. This was not chaos, it was coordination. Frank Lucas felt the pressure, but he did not panic. Panic creates mistakes, and mistakes attract attention. Instead, he tightened the system. Communication was reduced. Roles became more isolated. Movement became more controlled. The absence of fear extended to leadership itself. Decisions were made calmly, deliberately. Law enforcement expanded surveillance. Wiretaps were installed. Informants were cultivated. Slowly, fragments of the operation surfaced. A courier here, a distributor there. None could identify the full structure, but each arrest revealed another small piece. The greatest threat to Lucas's empire was no longer rivals or violence, it was human stress. Long prison sentences changed behavior. Loyalty, once natural, was tested under pressure. Some cooperated, others made mistakes. Still, the system held longer than expected. Because it was not built on fear, there were fewer grudges, fewer impulsive betrayals. People didn't turn out of hatred, they turned out of survival. And that difference mattered. Harlem felt the change. Surveillance became more visible. Police presence increased. Dealers grew cautious. The quiet predictability of the streets began to feel tense, though not chaotic. Even as pressure mounted, Lucas refused to revert to intimidation. Violence would have drawn attention and confirmed suspicions. Fear would have accelerated collapse. He stayed committed to structure and silence. Federal investigators began coordinating across cities. What once looked like isolated operations now appeared connected. Patterns aligned. The invisible architecture of the empire became faintly visible. Lucas understood the truth every strategist eventually faces. No system built entirely on people can remain perfect forever. Fear-free control reduced rebellion, but it could not eliminate human weakness. The question was no longer whether the empire could survive, but how long it could delay collapse. And as federal pressure intensified, the empire built without fear stood at its most dangerous moment, not because it was failing, but because it was still functioning under extreme scrutiny. The fall, when it came, would not be violent. It would be procedural. When Frank Lucas's empire finally began to fall, it did not collapse in flames. There were no shootouts, no street wars, no desperate acts of intimidation. The system he had built without fear ended the same way it had operated, quietly. Federal arrests came methodically. Couriers were taken first, then distributors, then money handlers. Each arrest removed a piece of the system, not violently but surgically. The flow slowed, then fractured. Because Lucas had avoided fear, there was no internal rebellion. No one rushed to overthrow him, but pressure changes priorities. Long prison sentences forced people to choose survival over loyalty. Information emerged in fragments, routes, schedules, names. Enough, eventually, to reveal the structure behind the silence. When Lucas himself was arrested, Harlem did not explode. It stalled. The predictability vanished. Dealers scrambled for new suppliers. Rival groups moved in, fighting openly. Violence surged, not because Lucas had enforced peace, but because he had enforced order. In court, prosecutors described Lucas not as a brutal gangster, but as an organizer. His empire resembled a corporation more than a street gang. The same discipline that had protected him now served as evidence. Lucas did not rage. He did not threaten. He adapted. He understood leverage. He cooperated selectively, providing information on corrupt officials and rival networks. This reduced his sentence and protected him from harsher consequences. Even in defeat, he avoided fear as a tool. Harlem felt the absence immediately. Without Lucas's structure, chaos returned. Violence increased. Supply became unstable. The system that had quietly governed behavior was gone. The irony was undeniable. The empire built without fear had reduced violence more effectively than any intimidation-based regime before it. And once it disappeared, fear returned to the streets. Lucas went to prison, but his influence lingered. Law enforcement dismantled the network, but they could not replicate the order it had imposed. The streets became louder, bloodier, and more unpredictable. His collapse revealed something unsettling. Fear is not the only way to control people, and sometimes it is the least effective. Frank Lucas had proven that discipline, consistency, and structure could dominate an entire city more thoroughly than violence ever could. And now, with the empire gone, the city was left to confront what fear-based power truly looked like. When Frank Lucas eventually returned to Harlem after serving his sentence, the city no longer resembled the one he had controlled. The streets were louder, violence was more visible, power shifted constantly. The order he had once imposed without fear was gone. Lucas never claimed to be a hero or a victim. In later interviews, he spoke calmly about systems, discipline, and human behavior. He acknowledged the damage caused by drugs and the lives lost, but he also pointed out a difficult truth. Fear had never been the foundation of his power. The structure was. His legacy is not found in shootouts or terror. It exists in the uncomfortable realization that influence does not require brutality. For years, Lucas exercised more control over Harlem than gangs, the mafia, or even street-level policing, without using fear as a primary tool. Law enforcement eventually dismantled his empire, but only after time, patience, and coordination. Lucas had not defeated the system. He had outpaced it. His success exposed the limits of institutions that look for violence to identify power. Criminologists later studied his operation not to glorify it, but to understand it. How could one man organize an illegal economy more efficiently than traditional crime families? How could loyalty replace intimidation? How could silence outperform terror? Harlem remembered him in conflicting ways. Some saw a cautionary tale of ambition and collapse. Others remembered a period when the streets were quieter, more predictable, even if still dangerous. The absence of fear had reduced chaos, but it had not removed harm. Frank Lucas passed away in 2019, leaving behind a story that challenged every stereotype of criminal power. He proved that fear is loud, but control can be silent. His empire fell, but the lesson remains. The most effective systems, legal or illegal, do not rely on constant threats. They rely on consistency, incentives, and understanding human behavior. Frank Lucas built his empire without fear. And when it disappeared, the streets felt the difference.